John's dream of a simple shed collided with an unyielding HOA rejection. His freedom, his property, all slipping away, until he uncovered a law that could shatter their control, the breakthrough he needed. What happened next wasn't just a victory, it was a battle for justice. But let's start from the beginning. John Harrison, an ordinary man with modest aspirations, had one simple goal: to build a small shed in his backyard. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't a grand structure, just a modest space for his tools, a quiet retreat for his personal projects. He pictured it, neatly tucked away, blending seamlessly into the landscape of his suburban home in Arizona. A place to work, a place to escape. But when he submitted his request to the Homeowners Association, HOA, the response was swift and blunt. The HOA, with its rigid rules and condescending tone, rejected his proposal. The reasoning? Aesthetic concerns. They claimed that the shed would ruin the character of the neighborhood. John, taken aback, couldn't fathom how a small, inconspicuous structure could be considered a threat to the neighborhood's image. He had always followed the rules, kept his lawn trimmed, and ensured his property didn't stand out. Yet now, he was being told that something as simple as a shed was unacceptable. The rejection felt personal, as if his quiet ambition had been dismissed without thought. It wasn't just about the shed anymore. It was about his right to decide what happened on his own property. The more John thought about it, the angrier he became. How could a group of strangers dictate what he could or couldn't do in his own yard? This wasn't just an isolated decision, it was part of a larger pattern of control. The HOA had their eyes on everything, from the color of the house to the height of the grass, and now they were encroaching on his freedom to live how he saw fit. It wasn't just about the shed anymore, it was about standing up for his rights. The rejection lit a fire inside him. He realized that the HOA, despite its lofty pretensions, was not invincible. And if there was one thing John had learned from years of hard work, it was that sometimes fighting back was the only way forward. As days passed, John found himself seething with anger. The more he reflected on the HOA's rejection, the more oppressive it felt. It wasn't just about the shed anymore. It was about the slow encroachment of a faceless authority that seemed intent on controlling every aspect of his life. The color of his fence, the size of his plants, even the type of flowers he was allowed to plant. It all felt like a slow, steady erosion of his freedom. The HOA, with its petty rules and rigid structure, seemed to thrive on making decisions that impacted people's lives without ever considering the individuals behind them. John had always believed in keeping the peace, respecting the neighborhood's general guidelines, but this was different. This wasn't a simple request for conformity. This was a power trip, and what stung the most was that the people who sat on the HOA board didn't even know him. They didn't care about his needs, his work, or his life. They were merely focused on their own power and authority. The more John thought about it, the more the resentment bubbled inside him. He realized that this wasn't just about a simple rejection. It was about an entire system that allowed people like them to dictate his choices, his daily life. The HOA didn't care about his well-being or the well-being of anyone else. They cared about maintaining control, imposing their rules on others without thought or empathy. And that angered him more than anything else. But it wasn't just about the HOA anymore. John's growing resentment was aimed at a larger, more insidious system, a system that allowed unaccountable entities like this to exist and thrive. A system where ordinary people could be subjugated to the whims of those in power. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became. This wasn't just a personal battle anymore. It was a fight for his right to control his own life, to make his own decisions, and to stand against an unjust system that had overstepped its bounds. The fire inside him burned brighter. He wasn't going to back down. He was going to fight. Late one evening, after hours of fruitlessly staring at his rejection letter, John sat hunched over his kitchen table. The frustration was consuming him, the feeling of powerlessness gnawing at his insides. He had done everything right. He had followed all the rules, kept his property pristine, and all he wanted was a small shed to store his tools and pursue his hobbies. Yet here he was, stifled by a system that didn't care about his needs, only its own arbitrary authority. The anger that had been simmering for days began to boil over, but as John scrolled through local legal resources for another project, something caught his eye. A glimmer of hope. A state law. A clause buried deep in the legal jargon that could change everything. It stated that HOA boards could not block certain property improvements as long as they complied with municipal codes. It was a legal loophole, one that the HOA had clearly overlooked or deliberately ignored. John's heart raced. This was it, a way to force the HOA to approve his shed. The law existed for situations like his, yet the HOA had never even mentioned it. How could they have blatantly disregarded it? The realization hit him hard. All the anger he'd been suppressing for days, weeks even, erupted. The HOA had treated him with contempt, dismissing his simple request with no real explanation, hiding behind their pretentious rules. And now, with this discovery, John saw the extent of their arrogance. They had assumed he wouldn't push back, that he wouldn't have the knowledge or the will to challenge their authority. But they were wrong. A fierce determination ignited within him. His dream of a small shed, something so simple, had been crushed by bureaucracy and entitlement. But now, he had the power to change that. The tables had turned, and for the first time John felt in control. The law was on his side, and he was ready to use it. This was no longer just about a shed. This was about standing up to the system, to the people who thought they could trample over him without consequence, and he wasn't going to let them get away with it. Armed with his newfound knowledge, John didn't hesitate. He took the matter to court, crafting a solid legal argument backed by the state law that protected his rights as a homeowner. The legal process wasn't easy, but John was relentless, determined to make his stand. When the HOA caught wind of his actions, panic spread among the board members. They realized their mistake, how they had overstepped, ignoring the very law that governed them. But by then, it was too late. The court had already heard his case, and with a firm voice, the judge ruled in John's favor, ordering the HOA to approve his shed. Victory didn't just come from getting the shed. It came from the satisfaction of knowing he had stood his ground against an unjust system. Watching the HOA board retreat, their arrogance deflated, was a sweet moment of triumph. John's small shed, once just a simple desire, had transformed into something much bigger, a symbol of his fight against control, a reminder that the powerless could rise up. The HOA had learned a hard lesson. Sometimes, even the smallest person can turn the tables and win.